started on Double Negative to work on a Bond film, every day would be, how are we gonna solve this? We've never done this before. Before they even set foot in a real location, we built several hundred kilometers of terrain. It was a working world. We had an artist with a Xbox controller driving the bus around. The real focus being on building a complex piece of software that solves one task that nobody else can solve. We worked on a project recently where we decided to try and approach it as a pure generative AI approach. You're kind of like, is this going to work?
Today I'm in London with Graham Jack, who is the CTO at beloFX, a visual effects and technology company with a track record of contributing to the VFX work of famous films. Some of the most recent examples being Mission Impossible, John Wick's Ballerina, and The Lost Bus. Graham co-founded beloFX after a long career in VFX, technology leadership, including 10 years as CTO at Double Negative, and he's here to talk about how tech is shaping workflows in visual effects and production. So Graham, thanks so much for making time.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Okay, awesome. So I would love to go back a bit and talk a bit about your early life and childhood to understand how you got here today. So where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
Sure. So I grew up in a little village in Scotland.
Wow.
Just outside Dundee. It's a sort of fairly normal upbringing. I guess I was pretty geeky as a kid. I was all about taking bits of electronics apart and trying to figure out how they worked. And, when computers came along, I was sort of an early adopter of computers, I guess, with the old Acorn Electron, which probably nobody remembers, learning to program. So that was kind of my early life. And then school, at school, I was always sort of trying to pick between an artistic career and a technical one.
I did notice that.
So my subjects that I did in kind of the senior levels of school was, I did art, but I also did physics and maths. And I sort of could never really make up my mind which way I wanted to go.
How did you get into coding those early days? I know some people got into it through some games or trying to program some games. What was your in?
Yeah, so in the UK there's this company called Acorn Computers that they made. The BBC Micro was their kind of most famous thing, and it was designed. It's a bit like the Raspberry Pi. It was designed to be a sort of really accessible computing platform, and you could buy games for it, but there wasn't loads of games, and so learning to program on that was sort of my earliest introduction to programming, and trying to make little games and things like that.
Yeah. This is a common theme I'm seeing. Awesome. And then if you had to give us the earliest piece of context from your life that you think shows who you are, what would that be? I
think, one of the earliest things I remember is we had an old VCR that didn't work anymore. And I must have spent weeks taking it apart and trying to figure out how it all worked. And so I think that's a big part of who I am, is how do things, I really want to know how things work, get into the nuts and bolts of it.
That's awesome. Okay, so you were between art and tech. You did end up studying engineering.
Yeah, so when it came time to decide what I wanted to go on to study, my university applications, I had, product design and, industrial design in there, but I also had, aeronautical engineering. And the one I ended up choosing was cybernetics and control engineering at Reading. What is that? So control engineering it's like the engineering of control systems, whatever they are. So it can mean electronics, but it can also be mechanical. And then we also did some study into environmental cybernetics, they called it, which is the control systems in the ecology, how you get control systems with weather and climate. And the one that, is kind of the most relevant now, I guess, and the one that I really enjoyed at the time was AI, because training a neural network is a feedback loop, and control theory is all about feedback loops. So, we were studying, this was back in the late 90s, I guess, we were studying, neural networks, multi-layer perceptrons, did a really interesting module on the philosophy of artificial intelligence, kind of back when nobody was talking about AI because the compute power wasn't there yet.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, my dad also did a PhD on AI back in his day, and I was like, what?
Yeah.
And then I was in an event in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, and there was someone from, I think, OpenAI, who was saying, can someone guess here when it was possible to build the tech that we have today? So like not when we actually built it, when it was
Yeah.
possible. And it turns out to be 2009.
Yeah.
We could have started building what we have today.
Interesting.
Versus like it delayed for like 15 years.
Yeah. Well, there was a sort of real backlash, wasn't there? The sort of so-called winter of AI. And I
Yeah.
think there was all this early promise, but there wasn't really the kind of compute to do anything useful with it. And then, everyone went off it, and there was this big backlash
Yep. Yeah.
before it started coming back.
Makes sense. Cool. So you studied engineering, and then you go on to spend your first 7 years as an animator and 3D artist, and that doesn't sound like the average first steps for people in your degree.
Yes. So most of the people who did my degree went on to run like building management systems or work in, the aerospace industry and things like that. And I think what I realized as I was studying engineering was, while I really liked the problem solving aspect of it, I was missing a creative aspect. And also I think, going into big established engineering companies, you become very siloed. You're solving one problem. And so sort of by accident, I found my way into computer graphics. It's always something I've been interested in. And when I was at school, me and some friends used to, we would go into the media studies lab and make little fake news reports and, funny little skits like that. And I was the person like running the video mixing board and stuff like that. And so I kind of had this kind of, I guess, background interest in computer graphics. Reached out to someone just to ask, what career pathways there were in computer graphics. And I just ended up at this, little kind of startup computer graphics unit at an established, traditional model making and compositing company. And I just happened to know more about the software than their artists did. And so they took me on. And so that's where my career in visual effects started. Sort of a bit of a coincidence, really. Lucky break.
Wow. So wait, that was the animator or the 3D artist part?
Well, that was, I started there essentially as a previous animator on a movie a very long time ago called Lost in Space. And so that was my first movie that I worked on, working out at the studios. So seeing the business of filmmaking every day, which was really fun.
Got it. Okay, so 3D art though is like a very steep learning curve, like to become a 3D artist. So how, like, no training, I guess, like not training through university, but like how did you learn all of that, or get all of these skills to become a 3D artist for a couple of years?
I guess just by using the software that I could get hold of and teaching myself.
What was the software back then?
So I used Lightwave 3D was the main software I was using, which was kind of niche. But sort of started with that. And the bit that, I started as an animator. I was never a very good animator. The bit that I was good at really was the kind of lighting and surfacing. So, how surfaces respond to light and that sort of thing. But it took me a while to sort of realize that, find that niche.
Yeah, which then connected to VFX.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So that was VFX back on Lost in Space. That was kind of working within that visual effects team. And I was working in the sort of previous department, so I was kind of planning out the shoots and the sets, that side of things.
If you compare kind of like your experience back then with what VFX was back then and what it is today,
it's hugely different, especially in the UK, I think, because in the US, the visual effects industry really grew out of movie making, and Star Wars and those kind of early visual effects movies, whereas in the UK it grew out of the advertising industry. So it was much smaller teams, more agile. So when I first started in visual effects, everyone was a bit of a generalist, a bit of a jack of all trades. There wasn't this room to have, specialist animators, lighters, modelers. Everyone kind of had to get their hands dirty and do a bit of everything.
So probably you could even count the people that had these skills in the UK.
It was pretty small, yeah. And then the big thing that changed that and really, kicked things up a gear here was Harry Potter. So that, just as I was sort of starting in the industry, Harry Potter started, and the first movies, a bit of the visual effects was done here, some of it was done in California, but then by the later movies, it was almost entirely done here.
Which brings us to Double Negative, right?
So
that work.
So in between Lost in Space and Double Negative, I did a few little interesting things. So after Lost in Space finished, there was a bit of a lull in the visual effects industry. And so I went off and I made holograms for a while. So that was kind of a slightly different use of the same skill set. We were figuring it all out ourselves and kind of making it up as we went along. So learned a lot there. But ultimately, I wanted to kind of get back into filmmaking.
Got it. Okay, so how did you get the job at Double Negative? You started as a VFX supervisor there.
Well, I started there as a sort of CG artist, so a generalist role. I'd worked at another company that was a sort of a web startup that was doing this, kind of converged TV broadcast and internet thing. So part of the tail end of the .com boom, I guess. And I was part of this tiny little promos department there. So we would make these little short films to promote the channel. And I got loads of experience there of this sort of on-set part of it. So I would go out on film shoots and things like that. And so that experience was really useful getting the job at Double Negative. So yeah, I started on Double Negative to work on a Bond film, and then and I think I started there on a 6-month contract and never intended to stay. It was just another job, but it was a great company. And,
that's funny.
Stayed there a long time.
How big was the company back then when you joined?
I think there was like 50 or 60 people.
Wow.
So yeah, when I started, every Friday we would gather in one of the rooms and have beer and pizza and things like that.
Okay. So you joined there. What was your day-to-day as a CG?
Yeah, so back then it was really, at that age of the industry, everything was a slightly unsolved problem. So, every day would be, how are we gonna solve this? We've never done this before. How's that going to work? And so there was a lot of figuring stuff out, and you find the person who's the best fit for that role. And and I always like to talk about in my intake, the people who joined at around the same time as me. We had there was me with an engineering background. We had another guy who was a session drummer. We had another guy who was a fine artist. So that kind of variety of skill set was what made it all work, because everyone would contribute something different to solving the problem. So yeah, there was a lot of that in the early days of just figuring out how we're going to do stuff.
Can you give an example of like a problem that you were like scratching your heads with back then that now is like super solved and like everyone would laugh at it?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's super solved, but convincing digital water, trying to make a water surface that looks real and convincing for an ocean. Back then, we didn't really know how to do that. And there was research out there. There's some great, academic papers, but then it was a case of trying to take that, make it work in the real world. So, we picked up some of those papers, and one of our engineers put something together, and then there was a lot of, head scratching, trying to figure out how to sort of make it work in practice. And, now that's something, back then this was a, computationally demanding task. It was, challenging. It took a long time. Now, that's something that you can pretty easily do in real time in a game engine.
Super cool. So computer graphics research papers, someone would like take them on to say like I'll go and like implement this and then
Yeah,
just iterate like
exactly.
based on that.
Yeah.
Wow. What about hair?
Yeah, I mean, I think hair is still a challenge in computer graphics. Trying to make it look really, particularly blonde hair.
Mm.
But yeah, back then it was really tough. So I think the one of the first projects I worked on where we had to do fur was we had to do this saber-toothed tiger for a movie, and yeah, that was the big challenge of that project, was figuring out how to generate the hair, let alone simulate it.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Um so how did you obviously you spent almost 20 years at Double Negative. How did you start kind of like transitioning your role and responsibilities to reach like obviously at CTO for the past 10 years?
Yeah, so I guess I started off moving up the sort of creative leadership path. So as a CG supervisor and then a visual effects supervisor, and as a visual effects supervisor, you end up getting sent out on to work on set for however many months it takes. So I was based out in Toronto for most of a summer, supervising the second unit on a project. At the same time, I just started a family. I had a 2-year-old, so that was really tough. So I was looking for a role that still allowed me to be solving problems and be in the in the kind of leadership of the company, that side of things. But I sort of didn't want to be in a position where the role required me to be away for months and months. And I was lucky enough that I had that technical skill set. So I think I pitched this role of head of technology strategy or something like that to join up some of the strands in the business, between the kind of development departments, the artists, and the kind of technology and infrastructure teams. And fortunately enough, the management at the time thought that was a good idea, and so I did that for a little bit, and then we didn't have a CTO at that point, and so part of my job in that role was trying to find a CTO to bring somebody in, and in the process of that, I think I realized that maybe that was the job for me, and I think everybody else realized that maybe I was the best candidate for it at the time. So then they ended up offering me that.
Makes sense. What were the biggest changes that you drove as CTO over these 10 years? Technology-wise, obviously.
Technology-wise, I think it was really the globalization of the business.
Mm.
So when I started, like I say, we were like 50 or 60 people in one floor of a building in London. And then when I took over, we had London, we had a very small office in Singapore, and that was it. And the process of setting up Singapore had been quite painful, and it took a long time. And I think one of the main kind of changes that I oversaw was, how do we position ourselves to be able to expand more easily? That was the direction of travel in the industry. We wanted to be able to set up a studio in Vancouver. So it was really trying to change the architecture of the systems to support, multiple sites in a kind of more seamless way.
And if you have to tell us a bit more low level of what this means, does this mean like how people work in parallel or submit work, or if you work like, is this like did you have to build low level tech for allowing for this?
Yes. So a lot of it was around synchronizing files and databases, really. And I think when some other studios, when they have set up offices in other countries, they'll do it almost as a brand new separate studio. So it's almost like working with an outsourced company or a partner. And I think we really wanted to make sure it was properly integrated. So an artist working in London, could collaborate with an artist working in Vancouver rather than it being this project goes here and this project goes there. Because we wanted to be able to tap into the right talent wherever they were. So projects could end up being shared across multiple sites.
Interesting.
Which adds an additional challenge to that synchronization because, somebody could be working on something in Vancouver that needs to get picked up the next day by, the downstream artist in another country.
But this means you work 24/7.
This means that the company
the work is getting progressed essentially 24/7. Like
exactly.
Yeah, if you
but
submit work.
Some of the data sets are huge, so the actual, the synchronization becomes a problem. So I had, a lot of challenges with kind of making it work so you can synchronize the data, but also a lot of challenges trying to explain to production people why, there had to be a bit of a lag. You couldn't immediately pick up that piece of work because, it might be several terabytes of simulation data that needs to get transferred from one country to another.
How long did it take you to architect and solve these problems?
It's really hard in visual effects to kind of put a number on anything like that because it's so fast and iterative that, how quickly did we get something that worked? Really quickly, weeks, months, that sort of thing. How long did it take to get it finished? It's still not finished.
Still going. Okay, makes sense. And so obviously, there's a lot of changes that happened in the VFX pipeline over these 20 years. What would you say are the highlights? Like shortly after you started versus before you left to start your own company, what were the key or like biggest changes the industry saw in terms of like pipelines and processes?
I think the biggest change really is, when I first started, and for a lot of the sort of early years, the thing that marked you out as a company was a capability. So you can do something that another company can't do. So, when we did Batman Begins with Christopher Nolan, one of the challenges of that movie was they had, this effect where there are these big plumes of steam bursting out of the roads in that film. And how you render the complex lighting on volumetric effect was not a solved problem. So that's something where we wrote our own renderers to be able to, handle that. And that kind of gave us an edge because we could do that. We could do, clouds, smoke, steam, and some companies couldn't, or it was much more challenging for them. So there was a phase when you were building these new capabilities, like another thing that we built early on was we had an in-house fluid dynamics solver, which is quite a challenging thing to write.
Yeah. What was his background?
Sorry?
What was his background?
Oh, sorry. There's a piece of
of
software. So I wrote the first one, and then we brought somebody in who kind of had a background in fluid dynamics who took it forwards, and that again that's a new capability,
right?
That not something that not everyone can do, and then it kind of moved towards the point where actually there's off-the-shelf software that can do most of these things. And so the thing that differentiates you is no longer being able to do something because anyone can go buy that software and do it. It's how efficiently you can do it and how strong your creative staff are to be able to translate the director's vision into, the use of that software. And so, that's where we saw this move from the real focus being on like building, a complex piece of software that solves one task that nobody else can solve, to you building a platform that can allow you to move work between different bits of software and different artists in as efficient a way as possible.
This is extremely interesting. So you're saying essentially the tech for making something happen in VFX slowly started getting commoditized. So then what actually gave the edge was the workflow of your team and the optimization for how content moves across the pipeline.
Exactly. Yeah. So it becomes more about, I think the first transition really was it becoming more about tracking data really accurately. So, the biggest inefficiency you can have is somebody working on the wrong version of a thing, and the other change in the way the work gets done is we moved from this world when I started where everybody did a bit of everything. And then, as teams get bigger, projects get more complex, you move to a world where you have more specialists. So you might have, 14 different departments working on a project, from, modeling, texturing, look development, all the way through to lighting, compositing, and tracking the data as it moves between those departments. That becomes a problem in itself. And if you've got somebody like, say you've got somebody doing a cloth simulation on a character, and the version of the animation that they're using to drive that cloth simulation is not the right version, that's all wasted work. And so that becomes the critical thing, is how do you make sure everyone knows that they're working on the right version? How do they make sure they've got at their fingertips all the latest creative notes so that you're not wasting any work and you stay as efficient as possible? So for a long time, that was the sort of real focus.
Really interesting. I think I see a parallel to what you are saying now with what is happening today with all of the AI kind of like tech that is coming out. So it seems like a repetition of like the tech is getting commoditized, or like, obviously like in more people can create and like lower, easier to get started, etc. So then it's like another cycle of even better workflows. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, to some extent, I agree. But the thing that I would say that I found really interesting as we've started working more with generative AI is, because it's quite a nascent technology, there's still things that it does. There's things that it does incredibly well, terrifyingly and astonishingly well. But there are things that it just can't do and can never do. And so in a way, we've gone back to a world where, when you're bidding on a project or you're kind of pitching a project in the early stages, you're not quite sure what's going to work and what's not going to work. So, in the early days of visual effects, I say this quite a lot, that, when a client came to you with a problem, you kind of say yes, and then you'd all look at each other and go, how are we going to do this? And then it kind of moved to this point where you'd say yes and you go, how are we going to do this for that price? And I think now with generative AI, we're back to, is this going to work? We'll give it a go. And that, to me, that's really exciting, because that's a much more interesting problem for me to solve, is can we do it rather than can we do it efficiently enough? So I think we're definitely in this phase with AI where, we're still finding our way. It's a lot of it's experimentation.
So do you mean that you're back in a point where you ask, can we do it, because what the client asks has changed and has like increased so much that you feel that like AI could be an accelerant there?
It's sort of, can you do it with AI? So we've, generative AI is still not much used in our industry, but it's sort of starting to gain some traction. And, we're sort of keen to be all over those tools and, understand the pros and cons and be able to offer it as a service if that's what our clients want to do. And some of our clients are, keen to push this and do tests. And so, we worked on a project recently where, in agreement with the client, we decided to try and approach it as a pure generative AI approach. So we were going to generate the final pixels in the images using video, generative AI. And that's where you're kind of like, is this going to work? I don't know. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. We'll see. There are still lots of limitations when it comes to shot-to-shot consistency or even frame-to-frame consistency that mean that it might not work. So, that's kind of an exciting place to be when you're not sure if it's going to work or not.
Awesome. Okay, so we've moved on now. Obviously, at beloFX, a company you co-founded 5 years ago, all of the projects that you're referencing now are with that. in that setting. So I have two questions. First of all, like when now clients come to you and they are excited to explore AI, what do you think is their motivation? Like, why are people, well, like the ones that are, because there are people that are not
Yeah.
excited to use AI?
I think there's sort of two main reasons. I think there are definitely people coming who want to use that technology because they think it'll make things cheaper. And there are other people who are coming to it because they think it'll allow them to do something that they couldn't otherwise do.
Example?
So, we've been doing some work on a project. I can't really talk about the specifics of the project, but, they want to have, tens or hundreds of different locations. And so to go and film that and is totally impractical. So if it doesn't work, and we don't still know whether that's going to come to fruition or not, but if that approach doesn't work, then the creative approach will have to be different. So that's where it's potentially enabling an effect which wouldn't be possible any other way. So it's not just about, can we do this a little bit cheaper? It's, can we do this thing that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise?
Okay, makes sense. And then you also mentioned there's some areas where AI, you've noticed it can totally excel, and then some areas that no way, like it could never do. Can you give some examples?
So it's very hard to give examples because in some ways you don't know until you try. We found almost counterintuitively one of the things we thought that it would be good at, is maybe shots, things that are easier in visual effects are hard surface, so a car, a plane, something like buildings, whereas the harder things are digital humans, organic creatures. And we've actually found that a video generation AI really struggles with hard surface because the shape is not, consistent from frame to frame. So you end up with something, you might have a car that, looks great on your opening frame, but by the time you get to the last frame, it's the number of wheels have changed, things like that.
Shape shifts.
Yeah. And you sort of get away with a lot more of that if it's something organic to start with.
Okay, sounds good. If you had to walk us through kind of like the most modern VFX pipeline that you guys have followed, are there any specific parts of this pipeline that you are really excited for AI potentially like evolving it, accelerating it, adding more creativity?
Yeah, I think so I guess to answer the first part of your question, in terms of like a modern visual effects pipeline, I think, the big thing that's shifted that's also really exciting is the sort of convergence of game technology and visual effects technology. So, using, when we set up the studio, the two things we wanted to really position ourselves to make the most out of was real-time rendering and kind of game technology and AI. So, the big projects that we've done with a sort of modern visual effects pipeline are all about this sort of real-time capabilities. And so you're trying to make sure that the bits of the process which require quick creative iteration, you keep them as real-time as possible.
Yeah.
And I think what's really exciting is when you can use using a game engine actually how it was intended as a game engine rather than just a nice real-time renderer. Yeah. That's what makes me excited. So it's building in interactivity and making the environment reactive so that you get a lot of things for free. And that's sort of back to what it's like making a film for real, where you point your camera at something and you don't know what you're going to get until you start filming.
Yeah.
So that's really exciting. And then on the AI side, I think, where it's exciting is it's so fast at generating versions and visual effects and creativity generally, it thrives on fast iterations. You have an idea, you want to see the result of that idea as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what's really exciting for me is when you can take those two aspects and join them together.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the control that you get from using a game engine to drive your visual effects process, and then you get that fast, high-end creative iteration you get from using generative AI tools.
Makes
So
sense.
that's, I feel, where it's going to get really interesting.
That's awesome. So obviously we were speaking earlier about the Lost Bus, which is some of your most recent work. Can you give us some examples of what you just said about all of this like pipeline, how you guys applied it for this project?
Yeah. So Lost Bus was a fantastic project. We were on really, really early. I think, we had people working on that project when I think we might have been, the fourth person on the project, our artists. It was just at the tail end of COVID. And, the director had this vision to make this movie. He's a director who's very, comfortable taking a camera into a setting and getting what he gets, filming in that environment, all handheld, to get this kind of really visceral realization of the story. And I think we'd worked with him various times before at the at Double Negative. We sort of knew that about him, and we wanted to make sure that we could sort of give him what he needed to be able to tell that story as early as possible. And so that meant that before they even set foot in a real location, we wanted to have something that could kind of represent the world that the story was going to take in. So, the movie, for anyone who doesn't know, is about the forest fires around Paradise, California. And so the first thing we did is we built several hundred kilometers of terrain around Paradise from survey data. And then we covered it in the right kind of forest. And we built all the roads and all the kind of housing as it would have been before the fires. And we built it so that it was a working world, so it had cars that would drive along the roads. They had, traffic systems that were built, in Unreal using their kind of AI character tools, so that they would, stop at stoplights and things like that. And we spent quite a lot of time building up this world that then meant that we could get in there. We had an artist with a Xbox controller driving the bus around. We could get the director of photography on from the project when they came online, and they could go in and actually use a kind of iPad as a virtual camera to figure out where they wanted to place the cameras. And we kept that process running all the way through the project. So when they were out on location, the client-side visual effects supervisor would film stuff on his iPhone, send it back to us. Wow. with the camera data embedded from the iPhone. We would drop that into our world, and then we could send him back a clip that said, this is what it would look like, on the day of the fires at this time of day. And so that meant that, they could really plan out how they wanted the story to work, and kind of get comfortable with the story before we hit the expensive bit of the visual effects process, where you really need to start going in and simulating complex fire and things like that. And I think you kind of see the result in the movie. It really holds together well. It feels like a real day in a real world in some really terrible, stressful event. And I think it's important for a story like that to get that sort of sense of truthfulness. And I don't think you would have got that any other way.
Yeah, it really pushes the boundaries of realism there. And I'm guessing this is what the director wanted as well, since he was so comfortable with filming.
Yeah.
In the real world. Okay, awesome. And then you mentioned in another interview I was listening to that with VFX, everything is like too well planned almost, and you sometimes lose the accidents.
Yes.
So do you think that like you created the whole city there like as a video game essentially in a game engine? Are there opportunities there to add like AI behavior on like humans or other moving items that reintroducing, you think, these accidents?
Absolutely, 100%. I think that that's what we were sort of trying to do with the Lost Bus is once you've got a world that works, you can start filming in that, and it becomes more like a traditional filmmaking process where, yes, you're directing the action. You're saying, the bus needs to go from here to here, but if it needs to stop because there's traffic in the way, that's something that you wouldn't necessarily have put in if you were just starting from a kind of pure animation standpoint. And I think there's loads of opportunities to do that sort of thing.
How would you do that? Like low level, how would a VFX team, at which level of the pipeline would they need to start thinking about this, like AI implementation for dictating interaction in the environment, and how would they build their process so that it supports that?
I think the big thing is really getting in early.
Okay.
So I think there's a sort of tendency for visual effects to be thought of as post-production, which is true. That's where the biggest part of the visual effects cost comes. But the more you can think of visual effects as being, pre-production, production, and post-production, we can be there the whole way through. The more you have opportunities to set that sort of thing up. And that was a huge credit, particularly to Charlie Noble, who was the client-side visual effects supervisor on Lost Bus, that he had the vision to get us on early so that we could spend the time to build that world. Because building a game is not an easy endeavor. It takes time.
Yeah.
And so you need to make that commitment up front to put the effort in.
How did you pitch that?
We sort of just started it.
You're like, we're just going to do it.
We're just going to do it.
We're just
exactly.
Gonna show you.
Yeah.
So you took the risk.
We took the risk. Yeah. Yeah.
How did you build the game essentially? Like, did you have to bring on board new types of people to work with you? Tell us a bit about like the process for creating all of these 3D assets.
We used Unreal Engine. When we started the company, we wanted that to be part of our pipeline. So we have quite a lot of people who know the engine fairly well. And in particular, one of our sort of very first employees was somebody that we'd worked with a lot over the years, a guy called Rick Leary, who, he started his career in the game industry, moved into visual effects, really long career supervising CG on movies in visual effects, but he was really excited about game engines in Unreal, and so essentially sort of taught himself the inner workings of Unreal Engine. And so a lot of it came down to him putting things together and really rapidly prototyping things. So taking lessons from the sort of way that the games industry works and sort of almost whiteboxing things, and then once you kind of figure out the layout and what's important, then you can use more traditional asset teams to go off and build the assets you need. So that was the approach there, really, is really small team and just get started and build stuff, and then go back and fill in the blanks later.
Is this a project where, if you wanted to bring it to life with like the fully traditional filming process of like going in the place and start filming, it wouldn't be possible, and essentially what you guys did like made this possible?
I think it's possible. It would have been possible. I think you could make a movie like that using traditional techniques, but I think it would have been poorer for it. I think by having this kind of real-time version of the world, you could really refine the storytelling. And there were things that kind of came out of that early process that weren't necessarily obvious in terms of the storytelling. So there was this idea of, you need an antagonist in the movie, and in that movie the antagonist really is the fire. And so they had this idea, the director had this idea of you want to kind of almost show the fire as you would a villain in a movie or something like that. And so because we had this world built and we had the fire systems built, we were able to put these shots together, which is almost like the fire's point of view as it moves through the forest, and different bits of the forest catch light and things like that. And I think it would have been hard to come up with that idea and hone it if you hadn't built that world.
100%.
And I think when we get to the sort of later stages of the project, the simulation and rendering of that much photoreal fire and smoke is really challenging. And you want, the more you kind of iterate at that stage, the more you just get kind of bogged down in these kind of multi-day turnarounds for these shots. And so I think that's also where, by building the, all of the timings, all the kind of key creative elements up front in real time, when you do get to that slow, expensive stage, you minimize the amount of time that you need to spend there. And so,
and the risk.
Yeah, exactly. And the risk. And so some of the, we often, every time we produce a render of something, it gets a new version number and they version up. And, I've definitely worked on projects where the final version numbers of an element that go into the final cut of the movie will be in the hundreds.
Wow.
You've done hundreds of versions of this. And, there were some elements going into that movie that were, one or two, because we sort of knew what the shot was before we
Wow.
had to hit the button. And I think, partly that's being able to go through that real-time planning stage, but another part of it that is important not to overlook is the talent of the artists who did that work as well, the simulation artists. And, our internal supervisor, Russ Bowen, who, oversaw that whole process, did a huge, he had a huge role in kind of ensuring that the kind of creative aspects from the early stages were preserved and translated into the highest possible quality final outputs. So, yeah, I think every film project is a huge team effort, and that one more than any.
I mean, it sounds like it was a huge accelerant for your team to have this like game world that you can prototype and iterate so much faster, so that, like, as you said, like you could like control the bus from like a console. You could simulate all of the camera perspectives, see what the shot would look like, and then the versions ended up being like 100 times less per frame for each of the frames. That sounds like a crazy accelerant. How would you compare like the acceleration that you got per frame at the end, at the kind of like time consuming process, with the upfront effort that I imagine obviously building all of this environment?
Yeah, I think it's hard, the anytime you work on a film project, there's a finite amount of time, there's a finite amount of money. So it's sort of hard to say, would it have been more expensive or would it have taken longer because there wasn't more time and there wasn't more money. So I think you have to look at the quality. I think we would have, if we hadn't utilized those techniques, if we hadn't put that effort in up front, would we still have finished the movie on time and on budget? Of course we would, but I think it wouldn't have been as good. And so that's the key takeaway for me is, yeah, I think it looks great and it really supports the story.
Absolutely. Awesome. So you've been you founded beloFX 5 years ago. You've been serving as CTO. You've taken on some amazing projects. What does your day-to-day as CTO at a leading VFX company look like?
It's a bit of everything, and I think that suits me because, my background and my skill set is a bit of a jack of all trades. So, I'll have, I might have a bunch of client meetings, where we're sort of pitching an approach or a way of doing things. We're starting to look at ways that we can diversify the business and doing more immersive projects. So talking to clients about approaches for, immersive projects is really interesting. But then I'm also talking to my engineering team. We're really close. We have this kind of nice informal kind of communications approach. So rather than a sort of formal, planning meeting every week or whatever, just when we need feedback, we'll just ping each other questions. And so, there'll be I'll be working on something, and one of the engineers will ping me and need feedback on something, and we'll just jump on a call and solve the problem. So
Very available.
yeah, so lots of that. And then I'm really hands-on. I love being hands-on, so that I'm also writing code, and I'm sure I frustrate the other people in the team because I tend to be the one who kind of prototypes stuff and then leaves other people to deal with the mess. But yeah, so I guess my day is trying to get some coding project done and being regularly interrupted with interesting meetings.
Nice. And then if for the other art leads, tech leads that are listening, what would you advise them? How would you advise them to think about, adopting or testing all of the new possibilities with AI or not? Like there's also non-AI innovations like the ones that you mentioned with your pipeline. So how would you advise them to think about all of that? And also how do then align the team right towards that direction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a few different answers to that. I think one is don't be afraid of it. I think with AI in particular, there's this real polarization going on. Where on the one hand you have the CEOs of big tech companies telling us how we're on the verge of AGI and it's going to change the world in fundamental ways, and it can kind of do everything and anything. And on the other hand, you've got people from the creative industries who are really worried about their jobs and the effect of that. And I think where the conversation should be is the nuance in between, because it is going to be a great tool, and it is already a great tool that's enabling new forms of creativity and new creative workflows. But it does have limitations, and some of those are technical limitations. Some of them are maybe ethical limitations. And so the more we can kind of talk about it in a grown-up, intelligent way, the better. So yeah, that's the first thing I would say is don't be afraid of it, and kind of get into that nuance in between, figure out what it can do and can't do. And then I think what's really worked well for us is you can play around with new technology, whether it's a game engine or whether it's generative AI. But until you have a project, you don't know whether it's going to help you or not. So you need something to do with it, and ideally, that's a real live project with real live clients and deadlines, because there's nothing like a genuine deadline to hold your feet to the fire and make you innovate and figure things out. So, but if not, then make your own project and kind of set yourself a deadline.
Amazing. Coming into an end, one of my last questions is like, if you can look forward into the future for the VFX space, what can you foresee in terms of like how the pipeline will evolve in the next like couple of years? Where do you see the most opportunity for better processes?
So I think there's a few things that I can see. So one is, I think I can see this rise of smaller companies that collaborate really well with others. So I think the really big visual effects companies are doing great and will carry on, but I think there's room for some little companies that work really well together. And I think part of that has been enabled by borrowing from game engines. That when you're working in Unreal Engine, once things are in the engine, they're there for everyone. So it actually becomes a good collaboration platform. And using Perforce and things like that, adopting some of those practices from the games industry, I think enables better collaboration between disparate companies. So that's one thing I could definitely see is kind of more collaboration and kind of really intentional collaboration. And I can see AI and generative AI getting more and more tightly integrated into pipelines, and I don't think that's something to be feared. I think it's, our experience has been that the best results still come when you have, a really good team of technical and creative problem solvers driving the tools. So to me, certainly in the kind of near term, I would put kind of generative AI in the visual effects pipeline into the category of it's another tool that enables brilliant creative work. So I think that's what we're looking at really is, lots of teams collaborating well together and using AI as a sort of force multiplier on the talent that you have within the companies.
Awesome. Well, I think your work is an inspiration for a lot of people. So thanks so much for taking time to speak with me.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's been great.
Thanks.